You guys were in the back talking about that little green card, and we were in the front reminiscing about old days at the church. I had nothing to say because I didn't too much grow up in church, nor did I grow up too much around one place for a long time. It's because my wife, no, my mom, she chose a different vocation. That was the military. And so we traveled. We traveled everywhere. So we didn't make friends, or we didn't know family, because we were too busy moving from one place to the next. 5 years old when my mom and dad got divorced. And I remember being in a cardboard box. That's what it felt like anyway. Shipped to Arizona. And then my mom leaving for about, I don't know, basic training. And then she had to get established. Seemed like we were with my grandparents for about a year or so. Felt like two. She sure did cure me of a lot of problems. So it was a good thing that I was with her. Not sure I'd be the person I am today without her. But after that, it was just me, my sister, and my mom. And the rest of the world. I used to think sitting on a green bus, military bus. Wonder where I'm going to end up one day. Because I knew sooner or later I would turn 18, graduate, and need to move out on my own. I just didn't know where we were going to land. And so we landed in Virginia. That's where we came stateside. And from there, I felt like I hiked over to South Carolina and spent time with my family that I never knew. And then from there, I married my high school sweetheart, and that's been the story for the rest of my days. But anyway, I didn't even grow up in Lancaster. I lived in Chester for 15 years, longest I ever lived in one place. And then now I moved to Lancaster, now it's 20 years. And so it's different when you come to a town and you don't know nobody. Yeah, it's just different. And I'm sure some of us can relate to that. That's the way it is. I want to carry on with church tradition here. We've been doing prayer night. So Acts chapter 12. Here's a familiar story. Paul's not in this story, but Peter is. Acts chapter 12. And it's verses 1 through 17. I won't read all the verses, but there are, this is a story that you know very well. James has been beheaded. Peter's been arrested, and he's in jail. And the church goes to what? Goes to praying. And this is a beautiful story of how sometimes there's things out of our control that we can't do nothing about. But the one thing we can do is give it over to the one who holds it all. And so the church begins to pray. And it says, now about about that time, verse 1, now about that time Herod the king stretched out his hand and to harass some of the church. So you see, the church is under persecution. The government says you can't meet. You can't teach the way you teach it. You can't believe the way you're believing. And so it was a hard time for the church. And verse 2 says, and then he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. Luke didn't beat around the bush. He just put it plain. This is a hard time. Hard time in the church. Hard time in the folks that are attending this church. Just a hard time flat out. And then it says, verse 3 says, and because he saw that it pleased the Jews. Wow. Who are the Jews? Isn't that God's people? That's right. And it says here, and it pleased the Jews. And guess who noticed it? Herod. he proceeded further to seize Peter also, and now it was during the days of the unleavened bread. This is a festival. And so when he had arrested him, he put him in prison, delivered him to the 4 squads of soldiers to keep him and intended to bring him before the people after Passover. I imagine he had the same intention to do to Peter what he did to James. All because he seemed to get praise. All because he thought, well, that's what everybody wants. And so here, Peter therefore was kept in prison, but constant, here it is, verse 5, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by who? By the church. Who's the church? 1 member? 200 members? Who's the church? Does it matter if all of them pray or just one of them pray? I think it matters that we just flat out pray. And so he begins to pray, and only one thing happens that we see that only God could do, and the church doesn't even believe it. That's a funny. It's a little bit of humor with a sense of tragedy in its midst. The big idea is this: when the church cannot do anything about the situation, the church can still pray about the situation. Because why? Because God is who God is. And so when you think about this, they prayed for the situation, and that's what it looks like, verses 1 through 5. And the scriptures tell us that it was constant prayer. It wasn't just one that was here and there. It wasn't one that was at the meal table. It wasn't one when you got up in the morning. It seemed as if it was constant prayer. Now, it wasn't in a church quite like this one or any other one that we can imagine in our mind, thinking about what you guys were saying about church and who was in it and things like that. I was standing quietly over there thinking about the church here. This was at a house. Church developed out of a house, out of a home, out of a small place. Sometimes Paul would say him and Silas and Timothy would go and find a place of quiet beside a river, sit down and pray. Philippians tells us, I think it's 4:13, to be what? To always be in prayer. And so you get the idea that prayer must have been very important to the church in the day of the church. And I think, I don't know what church thinks about prayer today. I thought about that this week, trying to think about, last week we talked about, sometimes we was in Acts 9. Sometimes the Bible doesn't say that they prayed, but you've got this sense that there had to be prayer in that situation. There just had to be prayer in that situation. Luke didn't record it. Didn't mean it didn't happen. It just meant he didn't record it. And so some things start like that. And so, it's being about being intentional with your life with faith. And sometimes, sometimes they're not going to mention the fact that we prayed, but I think prayer is the central part of a Christian life. When you became a believer, think about it. What's something that you started? You developed prayer. I don't know how you did it. There wasn't a manual. Back in the day, they had prayer booklets, little handouts, pamphlets. If you've got one of them, you've got a treasure. The Puritans put them out. There was other denominations that put them out too, but they were something, and you can't find them no more. They're not printed anymore, and you won't find them much in church pews anymore. But they were just something that you could put in your hand, a prayer book. I've been working on a prayer book and do that devotion. We finished it up back in January, February, March. I think I finished it in March. And I've had a couple of projects going on. And one of them was a prayer book. And so I've been studying and reading and searching, not every day, but in some time, Puritan prayers, some old prayers, Lutheran, just getting a feel for what the church prayed, how they prayed, what they prayed about. As long as you guys have been in the church. I know you got some people here that have been here a long time. Have you ever seen one of those prayer books in a Baptist denomination? Anything like that? Nobody? Nobody's ever seen one like that? Yeah. I haven't either. But to be honest with you, I've only known one denomination, and that's Baptist. My dad and my mom were Methodist. My grandmother took me to church every Sunday when I lived with her, but I couldn't tell you what denomination we were. I just know we went to church. And there were rules, and you followed them rules, and you were okay when you got home. But I didn't know what denomination. I just remember there was a man up front. There was pews in the back, and there was people sitting in them. There was a Bible in somebody's hand on either side of me. And, I didn't know much about what was going on. I imagine we all been there somehow. But, I know they prayed when they opened, and I know they prayed when they closed. I remember my grandmother praying beside me, laying down, knelt down at the bed. I remember praying for dinner. I remember praying. Sometimes she'd let me pray. And she taught you a little prayer. You know how we teach kids prayers? These are the kind of things that I was looking for, trying to remember when developing a prayer book. What is it that I want Asher to? How do we teach our kids to pray? How do we teach our adult children to pray? Sometimes we meet in the back. I don't know if you guys know that, but we meet in the back. We used to meet right here every Sunday morning, a few guys, and pray. I don't know. Seems like prayer just kind of drifted off. I don't know. Maybe it's just me because I'm always here, never anywhere else. We attend First Baptist on Wednesday nights. We do that. Evie and I just want to be fed somewhere, so we go there, and we listen to preaching, and we just sit down, They open with prayer, close with prayer. I attended one prayer meeting, and I've never seen really much of prayer. So I thought, well, maybe it's something that just isn't common in churches anymore. I don't know. You read this passage here, and it says, Peter, therefore, kept in prison, but constant prayer. You see where my mind's gone. I read that, and I was thinking about prayer, constant prayer. What's it feel like to have constant prayer? I looked at my own life. That's what the Bible says, pull the log out of your own eye before you go pointing at somebody else. My life's not filled with constant prayer. Now, they had a specific situation. And this church has a prayer. I took it out. It's at my desk in my office at home. I keep it on the desk just to read over. But, every week we've been reading those names. You guys been reading those names? And I've circled over a dozen names that I have no idea who they are or the situation that they're in. And I thought, wow. I'm the pastor of the church, and I don't even know what, a dozen names or what the spiritual issue is going on or the general, and I thought physical need. I said, man, that's a sorry pastor. Just being real. And then it's not, man, but constant prayer, And when you see this passage here and you see this church and you realize there's a word here that's brought up. I think it's, It's actually two words that circled it, but prayer. But prayer. Paul writes in the book of Romans several times, and I love coming across this, but God. But God. It seems like it has this emphasis on this idea. There's a problem, but God has a solution. He didn't say he's going to make it right for you, and there may be some rivers to cross or some storms to go through and some time to spend, but God. But God. And I thought to myself, but prayer. but prayer. There's probably going to be some time between when you said it and when it gets answered. There's probably going to be a few rivers that you cross and some storms that you go through and maybe never even hear a response to it. But prayer. But prayer. There's a dozen names circled on that list at my desk. On my desk, and I don't know but prayer. But there's a reason to be praying. Because I pray to the one who knows. And I think sometimes we stand up here and we don't know all of the circumstances or situations, but there's prayer. We're calling names out. We're mentioning churches. There's the second week, by the way, of August. This is the week of prayer. This is the month of prayer that Moriah Association has asked us to be a part of. I don't know how long that's been a tradition, but it seems as if August is the month of prayer. And schools and organizations and so it's a way. I think it's a good way to do something to connect us as a body of believers in communities all across this state right here to do one thing: pray, constant prayer. They did. Yeah, we went with First Baptist, and we went to, yeah. We wrote postcards and placed them. Amen. Amen. We left postage. We taped them to the desk or to classrooms. We walked through those. It's the school over there behind where Arby's is. What's the name of that school? Asher goes there. That's why we went to that school. North, okay, yeah. And so we went there and prayed just because that was where a place that our grandchildren went. We knew that church would be there, so we went. Last year we were about 5 minutes too late, so we had to walk around the church and pray outside because we couldn't get in. They had the doors locked. But it doesn't matter. We prayed from outside while they were praying on the inside. But prayer. Here's a neat little thing. They prayed together. Verse 12 says that they prayed together. Verse 11 says that when Peter had come to himself, he said, now there's an event that takes place here. So yeah, there's something amazing has just happened to Peter in his life. This is one of those moments that you just will never forget in your life. He was in a jail held by 4 squads, and God did something amazing. He put everybody asleep, unlocked all the doors, and gave Peter a personal escort out of jail. Rescued his life and did something in his life that he'd never forget. And then in verse 11, and Peter came to himself, and he said, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent an angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod. And from all, what does it say? And from all the expectations of the Jewish people. Man, they were really excited about trying to kill Peter or persecute the church. They just didn't like him. I don't know. I thought to myself for a minute, you ever just not been liked by somebody? The way you look, the way you act, the way you talk, I don't know, you just don't fit in. For some reason, Peter and the church didn't fit in. So they made it an extra exception to make sure that they put it into it. Verse 12 says, and when they considered this, and when he considered this, he came to the house of Mary. What is he considering right here? What do you think, Peter? I mean, he just got released from jail on let's just put it that way. And now he's considering what? Going to where? Mary's house. You know, you think it's where other believers are? You think he wants to be where fellow like-minded people are? Do you think he's going there to tell the story, to be a testimony to what God had done, an encourager? He's going there maybe because Maybe it's family. There's a lot of background to this, but the idea is he's going to a place where others are gathered. I love that idea. We've been having some people visit our church lately. Have you noticed that? They're coming where a place to gather. They got up Sunday morning. They don't belong to a church, or if they do, they're just visiting other churches. And what are they doing? The same thing Peter's doing. Coming to a place that others are like-minded in their faith. You know? I thought that's what I thought anyway. Maybe you can read something else into it. But they gathered together, and it says this, and in Mary's house, and the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. So you see here, John Mark. He's going to have a part in the missionary. This is one big family here, one big community here, where they were gathered together praying. I thought to myself, maybe Peter said, you know what, I need prayer. Something just amazing happened. And I want to be where others are. And I want to pray. I want to give thanks to God. Didn't Paul say that? We're to what? Give thanks in all things. You know? And so it's as if Peter's spirit says, I need to be a place where I can just pray. Verse 13, and he says, Peter knocked at the door of the gate, and a girl named, I said Rhonda. I've been saying Rhonda all day, but it's Rhoda, came to answer. I just want to pause for a minute because, you know, Peter came to a place that he knew was familiar and he knew was safe. That's what our church needs to be. We need to be a place that's familiar, and we need to be a place that is safe, because there's a lot going on in our lives. And we need to be, you know, about that. And I think Peter came and he knocks on the door, and this house must have had either younger servants or just people that were gathered in that house because they felt like it was a place they could call home. And this is what she did. She ran to the door to open it. Now, this is a courtyard. If you get the picture of what this place looks like, it wasn't like walking up to your or my house, knocking on the door. More than likely, it was a courtyard and then a real door that was probably locked, and the inner house that was in that courtyard, so kind of fenced in, if you want to think of it like that. And they probably had the place locked because, you know, it wasn't a good thing to be called a Christian in the day of Peter. Not in the world's eyes, anyway. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. And so she doesn't recognize Peter because she thinks Peter's where? In prison. How does she know that? Because she's a part of this group of people who have been praying, who have been saying Peter's name. Maybe James, his family's name. Maybe just all of this discussion. And so when she does it, verse 14 said when she organized Peter, and when she recognized Peter's voice because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but she ran back into the house to announce that Peter was there. So excited about Peter being at the house, not in prison, wanting to tell them that, hey, your prayers have been answered. Look what it is that he left Peter at the door. You know, I don't know. You get this sometimes, like in the study, Chris or I, maybe even Philip. I don't know if Philip's ever said it or not. We're just thankful for the joy that's in the room, for the laughter in the room, for the excitement that's in the room. You know. I don't think we should take that too lightly. Imagine, I mean, it must have been a heavy, heavy spirit in that house. And then she recognizes Peter's voice. I bet you she hesitated to open the door. She probably, Luke didn't record it, but she probably said, hey, who's there? And when she heard Peter's voice, recognizing it, simply didn't take the time, but just wanted to bring that joy into a heavy place. A burden in the hearts of the people of God. God was working while they were praying. I think that's the one thing that I think that, you pull out of the text, that I think every believer reading this text would probably say that same thing. God is working while the people of God are praying. And guess what they didn't know? The same thing that we don't know. But we take it for what it is, because we know that because we don't see it doesn't mean that God isn't working on it. You think we list those names last week, all the churches and the pastors. We have listed all the names from VBS. We have listed all the names in this church. We've prayed about all the spiritual and the physical needs that are in those families and needs in this church. And you know what we're doing? We're praying while God is doing what? Working. And no, even if it's only one or two, I've heard the deacons say that. Or if we got a group the size that we got tonight. It doesn't matter. Our prayers are being heard and God is working. Even if we can't see it. Even if we can't justify it. Even if we can't prove it. Even if we can't convince ourselves that's the reason to come to prayer. It ought to be enough to know that God is working. And so while the church was praying, the angel was releasing them. And I think she says that can't. When she comes in and she says, when she comes in here, Peter knocked. I'll give you the text. I was reading it from there. But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Now look. I go back because I want you to hear this. Verse 14, when she recognized Peter's voice, she did what? She was glad, and she ran, and she didn't open the door. She ran to the house. Verse 15, but she said to her, they said to her, when she announced that Peter's at the gate, verse 15 says, but they said, you are beside yourself. Sit down. You ever heard that growing up? You're acting crazy. You're acting out of character. You're making a fool out of yourself. Sit down. And I don't think they meant it in the way that I just said it. I wanted you to hear it that way, because sometimes that's how we react. The Bible tells us what, Gene? To think like foolish things. I think Gene was quoting something, a proverb here a little while ago. And, but I think God uses the foolish things to confound the wise. Who was the wise one in the room, and who was the fool when she come rushing in? You see, she heard the voice. She knew Peter was out there. She may have been a young child, and her responsibilities were to gather water, do the sweeping, do a couple of laundry, and open the door. But guess what? She knew Peter's voice. And she recognized it. And so they told her she was beside herself. There's no way that Peter's out of jail. That's just not going to happen. But, I'm going to tell you, sometimes, I think what that proves is their faith wasn't perfect. I think we get this idea that the first early church was, man, they had it all together. They didn't have problems in the church. They didn't have this. But, if you read the letters, that's not true. We know that to be true, that there was situations. But the thought is this, we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to have it all together. This don't have to be a 3-point message and exactly a time. We could just come and talk about the text and be encouraged with the Word of God and just pray. Be about prayer and be about God and be about His business and be encouraged. Be encouraged when we leave here. I want to give you a closing thought. Maybe tonight there's a Peter in prison somewhere in your life. I don't know what that looks like. Other than maybe that sometimes my thoughts capture me and convince me, imprison me. Maybe I'll be the only one that's bold enough to say there's something going on. and the flesh that's contending with the spirit. And and so maybe sometimes just knowing that I need prayer helps me overcome sin in my life, difficulties in my life, listening to the wrong voice in my life. And so I'm encouraged this afternoon. Acts 12 doesn't tell us that God will always answer exactly the way that we want. Why do I say that? Why was it Peter that was let loose and not James? Why did God save Peter and didn't save James? Why he loved that family just as much as he loved the other family? Why? Because sometimes God, and we don't know his ways. Our thoughts are not his thoughts. Our ways are not his ways. He understands and he knows. But that tells us right there that sometimes our prayers aren't answered, but we're still called to constantly pray and be about his business. Prayer isn't controlling God. That's not what these two men are doing up here on a Sunday. They're not controlling God. They're not telling God what needs to be done. They're lifting needs and names and situations that are out of our control to the one who has things in control. That family wasn't praying, telling God, you release Peter now. They were praying because they knew that God had the ability, was able to do that. You ever heard that? Your will be done? Yeah. Prayer is this. If you don't take nothing else out of tonight, prayer is this. Prayer is trusting. Prayer is trusting. Think about that. When you pray, what you really are doing deep down is trusting something to someone else. I'm trusting God to answer this prayer. I'm trusting you, God, that if you don't answer that prayer, that you'll comfort me, strengthen me, walk with me while I continue to pray this prayer. I'm going to turn this over to the two guys.
Peter was scared the first time.
Imagine so.
When he cut that man's ear off.